Hello and welcome back to a bike nerd looking at a bike and talking about a bike. My name is Graham. I'm the owner of Bike Bros, a bicycle shop in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada. And what I do is I look at bikes, have a look at specifications, talk about who that bike might suit, and the pluses and minuses of that bike and its specifications, summary, sometimes looking at comparables from different brands, and in the end you are sick of my voice, but you might know a little bit more about a given bike. Today we are looking at the 2023 Marin Muirwoods. This is a long-standing bike in the Marin family of bikes. For the last dozen years or so that I can remember, it has basically been a chromoly commuter bike, which always seems to inspire thoughts of doing crazy customizing things because steel bikes just do that. This is an $1,149 bike. This is a 2023, but it is unchanged from 2022. I believe that was the first year of this current design. Before I forget to mention it, it is $1,149 Canadian, which equates to about $8.99 US dollars, and it is a 29.6 pound Cromolly commuter bike. I am going to look at a bunch of details. I'm going to look at a bunch of things which to me make this a bike that really inspires bike shop people to want to do customizations and stuff. And at the end of this, you'll know a little bit more about the 2023 Marin Muirwoods. So let's get to it. So to start with on this, I just want to make sure that people are comfortable with chromoly and steel. Those two terms are used pretty much synonymously when it comes to bicycles. But chromoly is a type of steel. Steel can be anything from just regular high carbon steel that we'll see on some cheap department store bikes. Then this stuff is chromoly. The chromoly name comes from steel alloy which combines chromium and molybdenum at a certain percentage amount that basically adds up to a bike that has a good amount of toughness and a good strength to weight ratio. Above chromoly, you'll see different levels of Reynolds being probably the most common one. What will happen is they either use ever so slightly different alloying elements, or they use different heat treating elements to increase that strength to weight ratio even more. But on this bike here, we're just talking about chromoly, so it does mean that it's stronger than a standard steel bike and does have those standard benefits of being a strong, durable, relatively light for its strength kind of a bike. Remember, when we're talking about steel bikes though, the one downside of steel is if you rode this thing through the ocean a bunch of times, it's going to basically corrode away to nothing because steel corrodes as opposed to aluminum basically not corroding. So that is the thing about steel. The other thing about steel, it rhymes with the word real. So steel is real is a very common term in the bike world because hardcore people tend to be really, really attracted to steel bikes. Some of what people are attracted to when it comes to that is the robust nature of steel. It tends to be basically a longer lasting material as far as being able to be just abused over and over before developing cracks, which aluminum can be more prone to. Between both, it's almost unheard of these days that people are actually breaking frames. But steel does tend to attract heavier riders or riders who are going to be doing heavily packed riding. So this bike being something that I would say sits on the border between being a commuter bike and being an exploring bikepacking bike. It's very suitable then that it is a steel frame because it's going to be really durable. And then one of the things that you'll hear some big proponents of steel talking about is the fact that steel has a really nice ride quality. And what that generally means is that it sort of feels like you just have a few less PSI in your tires, because the steel tends to just absorb a little bit more vibration than aluminum, which is sort of known as being a little bit more of a stiffer material that transmits more vibration. What you tend to see even on a lot of carbon bikes is they will perhaps try to mimic what we get out of the steel feel on a bike. So I just wanted to touch on that material thing before we get talking too much, so that when we're talking about that and the whats and whys, you at least kind of know where my assumptions or knowledge is, or what I can pass along about chromoly. So we already touched upon the steel thing. Now I'm just going to have a quick look at specifications on this bike. Drivetrain, courtesy of an Advent X, that's Microshift as the brand. Advent X, the X part meaning X like 10 in Roman numerals. How's about that for a new word? Numerals. 10-speed drivetrain with a range from 11 to 51 teeth on that cassette. So this is a case where we have a 1x drivetrain. There is no front derailleur, but we get a massive range of gears on the rear to basically simulate the breadth of gears that you would get if you had a front derailleur. Along with that, this Microshift Advent X derailleur has a clutch on it. That is a thing that means that in the off position we can move that really easily. In the on position we get a little bit more pronounced spring in there. So that, along with that big wide range cassette and a chainring which has teeth that alternate from narrow to wide teeth, that all adds up to basically giving you something that you're less likely to have the chain bouncing off, because we're keeping a little bit more tension in the chain even without pedaling. So all those things add up to a bike that you can then assume is designed to see a little bit more bumpy terrain and handle it without the chain flying all over the place. The reason that they give you this off position with very little tension is so if you get a flat and if you have to take your rear wheel off, you're not going to be battling all of that extra tension and inventing new swear words as you try to do that. The rims on here are Marin's, one of their in-house rims. It looks to me like about a 30mm external width, so probably about 25mm internal width. That is clad in some Schwalbe Citizen 42C tires, so that means these tires are about 42mm wide when inflated. All that stuff is mounted on a basically a no-name in-house Marin branded hub, which is 135mm spacing, standard, quick release, as opposed to being a through axle, which we are seeing on a lot of higher end either mountain bikes or gravel or road bikes these days. So, chromoly frame, we have on the dropout here mounts for fenders and pannier rack, that type of thing. Up top we once again have pannier rack mounts, a little center hole in the bridge here which would be a practical point to attach a fender perhaps, and then down here at the chainstay bridge a little threaded insert there as well. So this thing is designed that you can put fenders on here. It's also got double water bottle mounts, down tube and seat tube. No big surprise to get something like that. And then on the fork we also have some mounts for whatever you want to put on the fork here. There are a number of different anything cage type things, which basically just, especially for bike packing, touring sort of thing, gives you a way that you can easily attach stuff onto your forks. Down at the bottom of the fork we have another mount for fenders, that sort of thing. And then in the center of the fork up here, another mount that would help you to put on fenders, that sort of stuff. The cables or brake lines on here are externally routed, no internal routing with this level of frame, but you do have these pretty nicely done little aluminum clamp on cable guides. So you do have a pretty nice system for holding cables in place. A little gusset underneath the down tube at the head tube junction here. This little distinctive thing, which would be much more expected on a Cromolly hardtail mountain bike. A little bit of a bend in the seat tube here to give us a little bit more tire clearance. Going back to this, that is also going to allow for just a little bit better standover height, although we have quite a long head tube on this bike as part of its design so that you don't have too slammed a front end height. And that is a non-tapered steer tube, meaning that it is just 1 1/8 steer tube, top and bottom, with integrated sort of headset, meaning that there's just angular contact cartridge bearings placed inside the frame. You don't have any cups that are pressed inside the frame or anything. That's sort of a detail that may or may not mean anything to you, but it does just mean that you got a little bit more sophistication than a cheaper frame that you'd be pressing in cups and kind of doing it old school. All the welds are pretty small and clean, like you would expect. That's one of the ways you can spot a steel frame, is the welds are quite a bit smaller than a traditional TIG weld on an aluminum frame. So we kind of have the gist. Oh, I'll just have to show you these brakes on here. The brakes are Tektros. They're a very standard sort of entry-level hydraulic disc brake with 160mm rotors, front and rear. So nothing to write home about, but also good enough to be good. And the big thing with disc brakes at this sort of level is that you're at least getting consistent braking in wet or dry conditions. The cranks that we're looking at here are basically a no-name square taper with a sealed cartridge bearing bottom bracket. That chainring that I briefly looked at a moment ago, narrow wide steel chainring that's pressed onto the crank, and that's 38 teeth. So if you want to do any calculations with what gear ranges are, 38 teeth matched with anything from 11 up to 51 teeth in the back. Just off the top of my head, I would say that that is just a huge practical usable range of gears. Attached to those cranks are these piece of crap pedals, which is just kind of standard fare these days for bikes. If they do come with pedals, they're going to be this kind of plasticky thing in nature, have pretty garbage bearings in them. So a very, very common upgrade, no matter if somebody's on a mountain bike or a commuter, is putting on pedals that at least have sealed cartridge bearings for longevity, and also steel pins for a little bit more aggressive interface with your shoe so you don't slip off the pedal, especially if it's first thing in the morning and you step on dewy grass and then step on that pedal, you may as well step on ice. Just coming back up top here, these are standard, just slide on friction grip. If you've watched a lot of my videos, every time you see one of these grips you hear me bitch about them, because I think now that we have a world with lock-on grips, I would personally just put lock-on grips on everything, because these things, as soon as some dust gets near them, it gets inside and then you just get throttle grip and the things turn too easily. The handlebars are Marin branded handlebar. They're zero rise, not a lot of sweep to them. Sweep meaning how much they kind of curve back or up. And then 31/8 diameter on a pretty stubby little 50mm long stem. This bike that we're looking at is a size large. I believe, if I remember correctly from looking at the other stock in the store before grabbing this one to bring to film, no matter the size of the bike, that stem length remains the same. Seat post is an alloy 330mm long, 27.2mm diameter thing. Saddle is a generic Marin branded, but nothing exciting. It's not good, not bad, just a saddle. One interesting thing to note on this frame is right there, center of frame. That little plug in the bottom of the seat tube is where a dropper post cable could go into this. So part of this bike's excitement, if you weren't just buying it stock, is that you can do a ton of weird shit on this thing. And you can use it as a commuter bike, as a standard bike, or you can just go crazy with all sorts of ways that this can be altered. That's going to be the next thing I'm going to talk about, which just leading out of the section on specifications, if all of these things as it is looks of interest to you, then this is an awesome stock commuter bike. It's going to ride quite stably because it's got a relatively slack 67.5 degree head tube angle. That's sort of what cutting edge in mountain bikes was 7 or 8 years ago. But that slackness, when we say slack, it means that angle is kind of more like that and less like that. Basically makes the bike handle a little bit more casually at higher speeds, makes the bike more stable. As opposed to when that's really steep, you can turn corners really quickly, but potentially when you're going fast, your bike can feel a little bit sketchy, especially if you are in bumpier terrain. The seat tube angle on this bike, 74 degrees, is a touch steeper than what would be common on a commuter bike. Those two things add up though. You want to have a slightly steeper seat tube angle when you have a slightly slacker head tube angle to keep some of your weight at least leaning on the handlebars so that you don't have issues with front wheel traction. So at this point, if you were just looking for a commuter bike, you can check out, because the next section I'm going to go into is all the things that make this bike exciting for big time bike nerds. And then I will go into a couple of the things, especially regarding the bike nerds and their application for this bike. That would be a little bit of a bummer, but that's what we go to next. So now we get into the stuff that appeals to the bike nerds, or the people who are at least just curious what the heck this old dork is talking about when he talks about this commuter bike being exciting for bike nerds. So to start with, I would say it is this general frame shape of a long head tube, long reach, what would be generally considered progressive geometry. This starts to approach the concept in geometry of something like the Surly Grappler. And that bike has gotten a lot of interest amongst hardcores because it basically is exciting for people who want to go drop bar, who want to go mega hardcore, wide kind of explorer drop bars, or flat bars. I think this bike does the exact same thing. It is going to get some people who are going to be happy with these flat bars. Mustache bars are going to be really an interesting thing to put on here. When I had a Muirwoods, which was a couple generations ago, I had mustache bars, and that was my kind of casual, fashionable gravel bike that I actually took a lot of pride in riding around, something that wasn't a carbon sort of a deal, and trying to keep up with people who were proud of their $10,000 bikes. But yeah, mustache bars would be popular, and I think some of the new school drop bars designed for gravel would be really good on here. And amongst all of those, you could be raising handlebars, lowering handlebars, increasing reach. All of those things I think would still agree with what this overall geometry is doing for you, and you would basically be making it like with mustache bars that had negative rise, putting your handlebars down a little bit. You would just be putting yourself in a little bit more ergonomic position to generate power. Mustache bars that actually had some rise to them would inspire a little bit more of a casual bike shop or bike path heading to a coffee shop kind of aesthetic to it. The gravel bars giving you an even more exaggerated sort of potential, at least, to get down into an aggressive position. Some more width would make the thing that much more kind of worthy of taking into really bumpy terrain. And then even stuff like some of the motocross inspired riser bars could still be kind of a play on both the aesthetics of the bike, but just giving you a bike that was just a fun bike because of the look of it, looking like a little bit of an adult's commuter BMX bike. I just love kind of all the different ways that this geometry basically inspires you to play with different things, and that would all work, I think, quite well. Going along with that, I think the dropper, if you've watched my videos on the headlands, I'm a huge fan of dropper posts on gravel bikes. So being able to add a dropper post to this adds another element of being able to make this more radical or just more different. The fact that you just have your shift lever here and you have nothing happening over on this side here, why not put another lever on there and have a dropper post? But the last thing that I think really inspires all of the crazy stuff on this bike is the fact that this has 42 millimeter wide tires on it. But it looks to me, we're looking at the space around the tires on the seat stays here. And then if you look down below, they've done some funky stuff to give us some extra clearance here while still allowing a massive amount of tire clearance. This gap, no matter where you measure it, top or bottom on the frame or even in the forks, is in the range of 3 inches plus. And then we're on a 700C wheel here, which means it's also a 29er wheel. So going back to my story that I once had in Muirwoods, I had 2 sets of wheels, one that had like narrower, faster, my gravel tires on there. And then when I wanted to be a doofus, I had a set of mountain bike wheels, and I put, in that case, only 2 1/4 tires on it. But in this case, you could really, like if you were doing some backcountry exploring, bike packing type things, like go 2.5, 2.6 for tires, even something like that. And you'll be able to ride your tires that much softer, get that much more comfort, have that much more air between rocks and pinching rims. So you could be packing this thing down and really morphing this into so many things, from it being almost like a heavy, simple cross-country mountain bike to a bike packing bike. I think it's those two things, the geometry and your tire clearance, are really the things that can get you excited on this bike. So to start with a bike that's $1,149, and having a look quickly at, this is at the interweb, it looks like that is in the range of $1,000 cheaper than what you're going to get a Surly grappler for. You basically get something you can ride and then add or delete parts as needed while you upgrade this, rather than starting with something that you feel a little bit silly about throwing even more money at, or at least that would be my thinking on something like a Surly grappler. So that is my 2 bits of wisdom about excitement for this bike. Geometry inspiring, doing crazy stuff with handlebars and stem length, allowing you to be more comfortable, more powerful, adjust for your body's proportions, all sorts of stuff there, and to make it just a fashionable sort of a statement. And then the fact that we've taken some inspiration from things like Chromags and stuff, with some nice frame design here to really give you tons of tire clearance, to be able to go crazy. You know that you can go down to 42Cs if you want fast gravelly tires, but yeah, go up to 29 by 2.5, 2.6, and I think you can basically turn this thing into a monster truck of a bike packing bike. I will next touch on those things that maybe I thought are kind of bummers about this bike. So those things that I think are bummers. In most of my videos, this is when I quickly go to slide on grips and say replace those, and I go to garbage pedals and say replace those. That's sort of becoming a predictable thing for this old bike nerd to say. My one and only complaint, I would say, is just because I find so much excitement in the fact that this bike could be so many things. I wish that they either made this bike with through axles instead of a quick release. So we have a standard quick release there, standard quick release there. If those were through axles, front and rear on this thing, it would definitely make you say this is an extremely high-end and capable frame attached to a bunch of suitably kind of bargain components, good enough to make just a standard good stock bike. So I wish that that there was either another level, a Muirwoods XR or something with through axles, and then they used that same frame to replace something like a Marin Four Corners being their touring bike with a little bit more of this radical idea of geometry. I think that would very much get into a bike that stood up against the grappler right out of the gate. The one thing I would say, if you still wanted to be really excited, part of my reason for the hesitancy of getting excited about quick releases in steel frames is that steel is a harder material for axles to bite into. So if you ended up riding this thing like a doofus, as I've kind of implied that I would want to ride this bike like a doofus, you have the tendency, or you have a chance maybe, under really, really hard braking or pedaling, that you might be able to ever so slightly shift your wheel in your dropouts. It may or may not happen. I might be overreacting, but the one thing that you could do, if you wanted to be a nerd on this bike and make your bike as capable as possible, is you could take out on a standard hub like this, 135 millimeter spacing with a quick release, just take the axle out and replace it with a 10 millimeter chromoly axle with nuts on it, and you will be able to at least clamp that wheel into the frame just a little bit tighter than what that quick release will do. Yes, you'll have to take a wrench with you in case you get a flat, but that might be your one and only trick. So I have pointed out an issue and I've come up with a solution already. That is why you watch these amazing videos from this guy from Cochrane, Alberta, Canada. So that is the 2023 Marin Muirwoods $1,149 Canadian, very cool Cromolly commuter bike as in stock, or mountain bike, bikepacking, exploring, single tracking, commuting, blasting around, fashionable coffee bike for people who want to get creative. Thanks for watching. If you like this sort of bike nerding, give us a subscribe. I wouldn't ring the bell because I've never rung the bell on anybody who's asked me to, because I don't want to be reminded of stuff. Just give me this stuff in my feed. Like the video, comment. I'd love to hear what people think actually about the Muirwoods being a bike that I'm so interested in myself. And I did put this video up because somebody in my DSX video said, hey, do a Muirwoods video. So if you've watched this long, and if there's another bike from Rocky Mountain, Pivot, Giant, Marin, Niner, I'd be happy to do a video on anything that we have in stock. So thanks for watching and happy bike nerding. Cheers.